I am Chris Rishko, CEO of Great Lakes Bay Michigan Works, and I would like to welcome you to today's panel discussion regarding the impact of the pandemic on job seekers. This panel discussion is being recorded and made available for those who are not able to attend today. Before we begin our discussion, let me introduce our panel members. Mike Larson is the President and CEO of Michigan Association of United Ways. With 20 plus years of experience with United Way, Mike provides strong, innovative, collaborative leadership to Michigan Association of United Ways as its president and CEO. Prior to joining Michigan Association of United Ways, Mike served as the president and CEO of the United Way of Battle Creek and Kalamazoo region. Mike served as the president and CPO at United Way of Greater Battle Creek from 1999 to 2008. Prior to coming to United Way of Greater Battle Creek, Mike was employed as the Executive Director of Livingston County United Way and the Vice President of United Way of Madison County. Welcome, Mike. Next, Dr. Scott Powell is the Director of the Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives within the Michigan Department of Technology, Management, and Budget. Scott and his team lead state efforts to turn labor market data into actionable information for state and local workforce partners. He has over 10 years of experience in facilitating evidence-based decision-making, specializing in advanced analytics, program evaluation, and longitudinal data systems. Before taking on his current role, Scott served as the Bureau's Director of Research for over 5 years. Prior to joining the state of Michigan, he held appointments at the Heldrick Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University, where he developed multiple research projects for the state of New Jersey, as well as the University of Tennessee. Scott is a native of Flint, Michigan area and holds degrees from Michigan State University and Ohio State University. Welcome, Scott. Juan Rosario is a Talent Solutions Manager for West Michigan Works, where he oversees daily operations of one of the service centers in Kent County. Juan has over 10 years of workforce development experience, ranging from working with local underserved youth to helping returning citizens under the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. Before joining West Michigan Works as a Talent Solutions Manager, he was responsible for establishing the Responsible Parent Program with Kent County Friend of the Court, where the goal was to help parents having difficulties paying their court-ordered child support find employment through public and private partnerships. Juan is currently also a member of the Kent County Essential Needs Task Force. Welcome, Juan. And the last member of our panel today is Lew Roubal. He is the Chief Deputy Director for Opportunity for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, where he oversees the department's efforts to provide food and medical assistance to residents in need. He is also a member of the Michigan Poverty Task Force. Lewis is a 20-year veteran of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, who has held leadership positions at the department for more than a decade. As a business services director at the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, he previously was responsible for delivering child welfare and adult and economic stability assistance to residents across 18 counties. In 2019, he served for several months on temporary assignment, helping renegotiate the modified implementation, sustainability, and exit plan at the Children's Services Agency. Earlier in his career, he served as Family Independence Specialist and as Director of the Mecosta Osceola County Office. Lewis earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Ferris State University. Welcome, Lew. Today's discussion is part of a series of panels taking place throughout April in recognition of the Michigan Works Association Workforce Advocacy Month. We hope to bring you an informative and spirited discussion today. Let's start today's discussion with a few questions for Dr. Scott Powell, Director and Chief Data Officer for the Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives. Dr. Powell, due to the impact of the pandemic, the 2020 Michigan jobless rate jumped to 9.7%. This was the highest annual rate since 2011. What was the impact on job seekers, and have some groups felt the effects more than others?
Thanks, Chris. And thanks to the Michigan Works Association for inviting me here today. It's great to see a lot of familiar names and faces on the call, and I'm glad we have such a great turnout. To answer your question, you mentioned that in 2020, unemployment rate jumped up quite a bit, almost 10%. But throughout the last year, right, we know that it's even gone higher than that, depending on when we look. So at the peak of the pandemic back in April, right, it was up 24% before coming down, and now we're under 6%. So we're getting closer to where we were prior to the pandemic. We're not quite all the way back there yet, but we're getting closer. But that being said, given everything that's happened over the last year, we know that everybody, and nobody has not been affected by this pandemic, but some groups, especially in the labor market, have been disproportionately affected much more than others. And so I just want to take a few minutes and elaborate on what those groups are and how they've been affected. So one of those groups that everybody's heard a lot about over the last few months or last year is women. So if we look at unemployment rates, we know that as far as unemployment goes, they've been affected like men have. Their unemployment rates relative to men have gone up a bit, but really where the action is in labor force participation. So with the unemployment rate, to be counted there, you've got to not just be not working, but looking for work. So individuals that just drop out of the labor market entirely and they're not looking for work, that's not going to catch that. So if we look at labor force participation, we know that well over 100,000 women dropped out of the labor force in Michigan entirely from February to December of last year. Right? So that's just an absolutely enormous number, whereas that number went up slightly actually for men. So we know a lot of women have dropped out of the labor force. Another group that's been disproportionately affected over the last year have been people of color. We know if we look at various metrics like the unemployment rate, duration of unemployment, how long people are looking, that these numbers are always showing a harder time for people of color than their white counterparts. So for instance, the Black unemployment rate over the course of the last year has averaged over 18%, roughly double what it is for whites. If we look at the duration of unemployment, we know that that's much longer for Hispanics than it is for whites, but also for Blacks as well. So people of color have been another group that have been disproportionately affected over the last year, certainly. One group that I know this crowd has heard plenty about is those working in our lower paying industries in Michigan. So if we were to kind of draw a line at about roughly $40,000, if we look at industries that pay annually on average less than $40,000 to the individuals working in those industries, we know that those industries have taken a much larger hit over the course of the last year as far as the number of jobs that are currently existing. So for instance, if we look at industries like accommodation and food services, we've seen an over 20% drop in payroll jobs over the last year in that industry. If we look at arts and entertainment, it's over 30%. If we look at administrative services, it's over 10%. So just really big, double digit as far as percentages go, losses in these industries. If we look at those industries that pay above $40,000 on average, we average those together, we look, it's under 5% loss in payroll jobs over last year relative, right? So much smaller loss, still a loss, but much, much smaller. So those individuals that were already making less, right, are the ones that were hit hardest in this pandemic. And then the last group I want to mention is just looking at educational attainment. So we know that individuals with lower levels of educational attainment, right, they always have a more difficult time in the labor market. So if we look at individuals with, that don't have a high school diploma, for instance, their unemployment rate is about 4 times as high as it is for individuals with a bachelor's degree. And so it's just a really, really big disparity there in unemployment rates as well as labor force participation. So we know there's a strong correlation between educational attainment and labor market outcomes. And so those individuals, of course, with lower levels of attainment have also been disproportionately affected, which just brings into sharp relief how important the role of Michigan Works is in education and training. Nothing I need to tell this group, but just really important, all the work that everybody's doing to get people into education and training programs.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'd like to elaborate a little more on something you mentioned as far as the report that the Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives just released on women in the workforce. Can you tell us a little more about the findings of that report and why it's so important? And just to note that the report is actually listed in the chat, the link to the report, so that anybody could reference that after or during our discussion.
Thanks for the link. That helps for sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the groups that have been disproportionately affected over the last year has certainly been women. But these disproportionate labor market outcomes for women, this is something that's been around for decades. It's just that COVID, just brought this into much sharper focus. So a couple things from the report, I think that I would like everybody to know. It's a fantastic report. The research team did a fantastic job putting this together, and you can take a look for yourselves. There's a lot in there. But one or a handful of things I want to make sure everybody's aware of just right now. One, as I mentioned, is labor force participation. So about 135,000 women between February and December of 2020 dropped out of labor force entirely, whereas for men, participation actually went up a little bit. And if we look at, even further, we drill down a little bit into parental status, we can see even further differences. So it's not that even all women were affected in the same way. So if we look at parental status, individuals that don't have children, for men and women both, we saw participation in the labor force go down, but then come back up. They followed fairly similar trajectories between men and women. If we look at individuals that have children, 18 years or less than 18 years old, we can see that again, there was a dip in participation for both men and women. While women are lagging men, both are trending back up. If we look at individuals with children under 5, this is where we see just really the starkest differences between men and women. Whereas there's a big drop for women. There was a drop for men as well, but they've more or less, men with children under 5, they're back to where they were before the pandemic as far as participation goes. Women have had almost no recovery at all to the women that have children under 5. So just a really big difference there. And obviously, things like childcare play a huge role when we look at problems like that. So labor force participation is one thing. A second thing, of course, is the pay gap. So this was a big part of the report, looking at the pay gap in Michigan. Women earn 78 cents on the dollar relative to men in Michigan. And this is slightly worse than it is nationally. So nationally, that number is 82 cents on the dollar. Still not a good number, but a little bit higher than it is here in Michigan. And this is for full-time year-round work. So it's not that, that number is not affected by women being more likely to work part-time or anything like that. That is an apples to apples comparison that women earn less. So there's that pay gap. That pay gap is only worse for women of color. So if we use white non-Hispanic men as the benchmark, right, so the number goes even lower to 65 cents on the dollar for Black women, and it gets even lower to 57 cents on the dollar for Hispanic women. So pay gap is a huge issue in the labor market. So that was a big part of the report. And then the third thing I want everybody to know about is poverty and the role that education plays in that, and how women are disproportionately affected by poverty. So it doesn't matter what level of educational attainment someone has, women have higher levels of poverty than men. Overall, it's 14% of women in Michigan are below the poverty line versus 12% for men. But of course, those educational attainment plays a big role here in a couple ways. So one is that as we expect, the more education someone has, the more they earn, the lower those poverty rates become. So it's a good thing in that more education, lower levels of poverty. But the difference, that poverty gap, if you will, between men and women actually gets lower as well. So the percentage of women in poverty versus men, if we look at those that don't have a high school diploma, it's big. There's a lot more women in poverty than there are men. If we go to the other end of the scale and look at individuals with a bachelor's degree, that gap is much smaller. So it reduces that poverty gap in addition to lowering poverty overall. So education does some really great things for poverty and women in the state, but it doesn't do everything. So another thing I want everybody to know is, interestingly, when it comes to the pay gap, it's actually larger when we look at higher levels of educational attainment. So the pay gap is actually largest when we look at individuals with a bachelor's degree. So what education is doing is that it's bringing wages up, which is a good thing, people out of poverty, but it's not doing enough to get women up to those highest paying positions. So only 1 in 4 individuals making $100,000 or more in the state is a woman. So there's more to do beyond just education. But again, thanks for the link. These are complex problems that require a lot of different policy solutions. But yeah, please take a look at the report.
Thank you, Scott. Last question for Dr. Powell. One of the many great publications that your Bureau publishes is the Michigan's Hot 50. I know we put that all over our service centers, which highlights the state's high demand, high wage careers through 2028. What are some of the hot jobs now? And most importantly, how has the pandemic impacted what those hot jobs are?
Sure, yeah. So there's a couple ways we can look at that, Chris. Both the short term and the long term. So short term being like what's happened over the last year, let's say, what's going on right now. Long term, let's look into the future. So if we look at the short term, just what's happened over the last year, I mean, one of the best ways to look at that is at job ads. And some of the trends we've seen in job ads over the last year are expected, some less so. So for instance, if we look at the first quarter of 2020 versus the first quarter of 2021, there wasn't that much difference in the volume of job ads. They weren't down that much, only about 2%. But if we look at the groups within those job ads, that's where we start to see some differences. So, some jobs where we're seeing really big differences and increases over the last year, transportation and material moving, right? So no shocker there. So everybody ordering things online, we got to, fulfill those orders, you got to deliver those orders. So the people that do that work, there's been a big increase in job ads for those kinds of positions. We've also seen a big increase in the number of ads over the last year for production positions, right? And so what's going on with those particular jobs is a little less clear. If we look at types of jobs that have gone in the other direction, ads that are going down, we can see we've seen a big decrease in computer and mathematical occupation ads. Again, not entirely clear what's going on to cause that. But some of these, a little more expected. So job ads are down for sales positions. They're down for food prep positions. And those are ones that, we'd be more likely to expect. Again, looking at education and the role that that plays. So we've actually seen the biggest increase in ads for jobs that require the lowest levels of education and training, those that, not much beyond high school diploma. We've seen a bit of a decrease in job ads for those that require things like a bachelor's degree. And while we don't know for sure what's causing that, right, we know that individuals with more education weathered the last year much better. And so it could just be that, they didn't lose their jobs. Employers aren't rushing out to hire right now, but those people kept their positions. It could be that what we're seeing with the ads for lower levels of attainment those were the jobs that were lost. Now we're starting to see them come back, right? They're posting those ads. That's the short term. Long term, though, you mentioned the Hot 50, and I think one thing I just want everybody to know is the way we do that. It's we do these 10-year projections, and they're meant to take things into account like recessions, these cyclical issues, and so that's still good, right? And we don't know what the long-term effects of COVID are going to be, and anybody that claims that they do know they're just guessing. I promise. So just keep that in mind. So as far as the Hot 50 goes that's out there now, the career outlook, absolutely, please still use those, still reference those. If we get any information that makes us think that those lists are now outdated, we're going to go ahead and publish some new information. And speaking of which, I know a lot of people on this call are very familiar with our regional career outlooks. So we have identify hot jobs by prosperity region and also by education and training categories. And we'll have new versions of those coming out this summer. So watch out for those.
Forgot my mute button. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Powell. I would like to talk next to Mike Larson, President and CEO of Michigan Association of United Ways. Mike, it has been 7 years since the Michigan Association of United Ways put out their first asset limited, income constrained, employed, or ALICE report. In late March, you put out a new ALICE report that not only encompasses expanded data points, but also reflects the impact of pandemic on the ALICE population. Please tell us about the latest ALICE report findings and why they are so important.
All right, thank you, Chris. Good morning to everybody. Absolutely. As Chris mentioned, we just released our most recent ALICE report for United Ways across the state of Michigan. This represents the most current data that we can get our hands on, which is 2019 data. And I say that in the sense of because we don't have data that's going to reflect what the COVID response or the impact is on working families. But what I want to highlight, because I think this kind of tells the story and it reflects in many cases, Scott, some of the things that you talked about earlier. What we are seeing is we have 1.5 million households, 38% of our population in Michigan that are in that ALICE threshold. They struggle to make ends meet each and every day. This is a real challenge for our families, our working families. The other thing that there's a new data point in here that also looks at the income just above that. And the reality is we have over 236,000 households that are at that tipping point. So all it takes is a car breaking down or whatever, they lose their job and they fall into that ALICE category. And the reality is you can imagine the people that were impacted by the pandemic are falling more into ALICE because of those types of scenarios. I think the other things that stand out in here is we've seen steady growth in the ALICE population. So you go from our first report in 2007 to our fourth report here in 2000, shows the 2019 data. We've seen a 6% increase in the ALICE population in Michigan. And what worries me about that is that's one of our, probably since 2009-10, we've seen some strong economic growth during that time frame, but it's not equitable with ALICE is the challenge that we're seeing. Something else that I think is really important in this data, it helps us understand where people are at. So if you look at hourly workers, 58% of our ALICE are making $20 or less. $20 or less is what the average hourly worker in Michigan makes. So that's a significant barrier in some cases for individuals. Scott, you mentioned a little bit about some of the disparities, and I think what I'm excited about, because I think this report really starts to dive into some of that equity issues that we see that are impacting families. So if you, as I mentioned before, 38% of our households in Michigan fall below the ALICE threshold. 60% of our Black households fall into that category. 48% of our Hispanic populations or households fall within that, in comparison to 34% of white households. So it really kind of puts a real significant lens on some of these challenges that I would say as the nonprofit sector, we're truly looking at and have to reshape our focus to make sure that we're targeting those most at-risk populations in our communities across the state. So all in really, really important work. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the story. I would also encourage the new ALICE report is, you can get to it at michiganalice.org. And there is a lot of opportunities to pull data by community. And I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, to go to the website and look at that. And learn to take advantage of the data sets that you can pull from that information.
Thank you, Mike. And for everyone's reference, that website is in the chat. Thank you, Steph, for putting that in there. Now let's turn to Lew Roubal, Chief Deputy Director for Opportunity for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and a member of the Michigan Poverty Task Force. Lew, the Michigan Poverty Task Force recently put out a report with its policy recommendations for the state. Please tell us about these recommendations and how they aim to tackle poverty in Michigan.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Glad to be with you today. Glad to be part of the Michigan Work Association event here. You know, the Poverty Task Force has been busy. The task force was established back in December of 19. They worked for about 14 solid months to come up with the 35 recommendations that are included in the report. And you'll know when you're reviewing these recommendations that they are very kind of broad and wide ranging. That reflects really the composition of the group. There was 14 state departments that were included in the task force and had worked to really identify the different areas where there was programming opportunities, resources that could help with addressing poverty in Michigan. Kim Trent from our Leo Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity heads this group and is incredibly active on it. She wasn't able to be here today, but has really just kind of leaned in and has brought about, I think, a lot of real tangible and important recommendations. So I know that each of these recommendations could probably be their own hour discussion. I'm going to quickly run through kind of some of the highlights that will be of particular interest with this group. In general, as that report was constructed, you'll notice that there's really kind of recommendations that fall into three distinct buckets. The first bucket is around kind of research and learning more and taking a deeper dive into understanding poverty and program impacts on poverty in the state. The second bucket really is around legislation, different things that can be done through the legislative ends. And then the third is policy. What are those things that are really most in control of the state departments? Looking at kind of that research bucket, there's really kind of three recommendations that are out there that would help to better frame kind of what we know and how we approach things. One of them is to conduct an in-depth study of the effectiveness of how we distribute TANF. TANF in Michigan is about $700 million in total. Of that, about 19% actually goes for basic assistance. Michigan's a little bit of an outlier here in that nationally about 52% of those funds goes for basic assistance. So there's some benefit in understanding what does that mean to low-income individuals and individuals facing poverty in Michigan. One of the things that often comes up while we're looking at our TANF usage is the fact that about $125 million of those 700 go to college scholarship opportunities, which I think we all are in agreement is helpful, and we know the importance of education. The issue, though, is that those scholarships right now are not directed to necessarily the lowest income individuals and families, and so therefore there's some question as to whether or not those are most impactful or could be differently utilized to support kind of individuals at the lower economic end of the spectrum. Another research-related recommendation is to look at a study of outcomes of TANF recipients and determine how they have fared 3 years since benefits ended. And we know that benefits can end for a variety of reasons. It can be due to income, due to family group changes, and or due to sanctions or other types of closure. So we would like to have a little bit better insight into what happens with those families to then use that information to better align our policies and our approaches along our FIP program. On the legislative front, there's a number of recommendations. Some of those include the time limits and what are considered countable months within the TANF program. So at the federal level, I think everybody's familiar with, there is a 60-month counter within the state of Michigan. That limit is 48 months. What we know is that the time limits often are impacting those families and living circumstances with individuals that have the largest barriers, and especially individuals who cycle on and off the program. I think that there is the potential for individuals to presume that somebody comes on FIP and stays on it for a continuous 4 years and then leaves. In reality, we know that individual circumstances often change. People become employed temporarily, will leave at times, however, come back on. And so especially in regards to supporting single parent households, the 48-month time limit and not allowing any type of disregard for individuals for when they're employed certainly is something that we think would make sense to take a look at. there's a few recommendations really around kind of the size of the FIP benefit. Now, this is interesting in that benefits today are about 34% lower than they were 15 years ago when we adjust for inflation. Now, Chris, I think you as well as our folks on the call today understand that housing specifically has gone up dramatically in the same time period. So right now, with housing being kind of the most significant of the safety net realities, we know that housing instability is likely for individuals who are currently receiving FIP, as the cash assistance, the maximum cash assistance, only covers about 55% of the average fair market value of housing cost right now. And then the second part of that is we know that housing instability directly impacts outcomes for children. So we really know that focusing on housing is incredibly important if we want to make a meaningful change and meaningful impact on low-income families' trajectories. There's a couple of additional legislative changes. One is there's a recommendation to end the asset test for food assistance. This is really interesting in that Michigan is one of a few select states that actually continues to have an asset test. What we know is that there is very few people that actually are denied benefits because of the asset maximum. Most people applying for benefits don't have a lot of assets at all. But what this does do is it delays the time in order for approvals to be granted on programs. So it essentially would remove a barrier, and we would shorten the time that people present with a need and our ability to meet that need. There is also a recommendation to establish what's called a LIHEAP program for water. For individuals who might not be familiar with this, we know that access to water is incredibly important. And this recommendation really speaks to the benefits if the state has some type of recurring revenue source. So individuals that are facing water shutoffs have a bit more resources available to help them out. There's a number of discussions and recommendations around sanctions as well. I would like to also point out, and understanding that we don't have a ton of time here, Chris, some recommendations around adopting a short-term family support program. This is really a diversion approach. The idea being, if we can identify situations where individuals could benefit from a short-term cash infusion to help get through an unexpected economic disruption. Typically, these individuals are, highly employable, but if it had something upset their life, either due to change of relationship or unforeseen change in employment status, we could keep them off of the rolls. And what research has shown is by being able to quickly intervene with a modest amount of resource, it then will change the trajectory of that family. We also think that there are some opportunities in regards to establishing MDOC notification processes. Really, this aims to look at when a individual is incarcerated, who's the primary wage earner in a family. What can we do to do proactive outreach so that family gets attached to assistance programs earlier on before their situation becomes overly dire? Furthermore, there's some discussion about really supplementing FIP benefits for certain populations. I had mentioned earlier about the importance of stable housing and how, the purchasing power of FIP has declined over time as housing costs and rental costs have risen. There's a number of states that are doing some work around this and actually looking at families with very young children. These are obviously the most vulnerable of families that typically are receiving FIP benefits and often facing the more significant needs, if you will. I think any of us who have had, children in diapers know that, for instance, that's an incredible expense. And so there's a recommendation here to look at doing some type of supplemental payment to those families, as well as incentivizing school attendance. So we aren't actually penalizing families due to truancy, but really using more of a carrot method to try to incentivize school attendance, as we know that education is an incredibly important here long term. Just maybe a couple of other ones here that folks might find interesting, but really a recommendation around digital divide. We know that with the CARES Act, we've got about $25 million more. I know on the Michigan work side, there's been great work done to help get the digital divide closed, especially in now and in the future. We know that access to high-speed internet is going to be incredible. Not only is that an infrastructure issue, it's also a training and skill development issue, which we're excited about. There's also interest in expanding children's savings accounts, and philanthropy has stepped up and wanted to have some discussions about, the benefits here, which would be exciting. As we know, it's important for low-income children and families to save in order to build assets that will be a long-term insulator from poverty. As well as expanding the housing choice voucher pilot between MSHDA and MDOC. So, one of the big things with citizens that are returning and exiting prison is to attach them to, again, stable housing. So a lot of parolees that don't have access to stable housing, this can very much hinder their post-incarceration success. So Chris, if anybody hasn't taken a look at the report, it's certainly constructed to be pretty much kind of to the point. I encourage folks to take a minute if they are so interested, become familiar with that. We are right now really working from the report to try to mobilize to understand kind of the best approach, if you will, to be able to implement some of these recommendations and learn more as we go. Our Michigan work partners across the board are incredibly important to engage on this front, and we look forward to that as we move forward.
Thank you, Lew, for everybody's information. The Poverty Task Force report the link for the report is in the chat right now. And discussing a little further on the report, one of the recommendations discusses ending a lifetime bans for work retirement violations. The Michigan Works Association has one of its 2021 state legislative priorities to both reinstate the time frame for work registration to 21 days and to expand work registration at Michigan Works to include virtual and in-person options. How can we work with the Poverty Task Force on this issue together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just kind of break it out in a couple of different things. The sanction, the lifetime sanction, is one that Michigan is really an outlier on. We know, and I had mentioned earlier, kind of the reality that a lot of families kind of cycle on and off of assistance until they can get a stable footing and really become self-sufficient from a durational standpoint. What we know is that from an equity standpoint, the lifetime ban is something that affects communities of color much more than white communities. And so we are starting to dig into that data and really feel that there's an opportunity here to really revisit the need for a final permanent lifetime ban. We certainly know that participation and active participation is important. We also know that there is at times when the circumstances in the home and the barriers that folks are facing are such that we are applying these pretty harsh sanctions, and nationally, Michigan again stands out on this front. And so we really would like to avoid that. Especially with the cycling of certain types of situations and residents who may make a choice in their 20s or 30s, and we don't necessarily know that that's the most appropriate to then prevent access to safety net services in their 40s, etc. The second part there is, we're really proud of the fact that we worked collaboratively with the Michigan Works Association and Workforce Development within LEO to understand the impact of the 21-day AEP, and worked last summer and fall with Dr. Schaefer at University of Michigan to come up with the 10-day AEP process. This really is about getting access to individuals who need safety net benefits quicker. And we are continuing to meet on it to understand the impact. Know that there is a number of forums where this gets discussed, and we'll continue to look at it to understand, if 10 days is the right days. Right now, we certainly feel that this is comfortable. We're seeing that the number of mean days in order from when somebody applies to when they start receiving benefits has been helpful. So that's good. I think, Chris, really the other thing kind of from a partnership standpoint is we're really trying to better understand the data around our FIP program and FIP outcomes. And, right now, the data, we're trying to stitch together different systems from the MWA, the LEO side, the UI side, and DHHS, and Dr. Powell, who we heard from earlier, has been helping with that. I really think as we look at the data more, there'll be some opportunities to either promote best practices and incentivize those things that we all want, figuring out how to get people on their way to economic stability flexibility, as well as understand opportunities that are there. Right now, at least from the DHS side, we don't know that we have as comprehensive a picture as what we would like to have to understand variations by county and regions regarding how our staff do their work, and how sanctions are applied and things of that nature. And I'm presuming, maybe incorrectly presuming, but on the MWA side, there's probably also some interest in exploring that. So I think that there is an opportunity there, Chris, for us certainly to partner with as we move forward on this journey.
Great. Thank you very much, Lew. Now it's time to turn to Juan Rosario, Talent Solutions Manager for West Michigan Works. Juan, I understand that West Michigan Works conducted a survey regarding the impact of the pandemic on job seekers in your region. Can you please tell us about the findings of that survey?
Yeah, we did. I'll give kind of some context, a little bit of background as to kind of why we initiated that survey. So we at West Michigan Works, so we have been seeing, and we are still seeing, low numbers in terms of individuals reaching out to us about, reemployment services. We're constantly on a day-to-day basis hearing from employers this kind of sense of, desperation, as to why individuals are not applying, why can't they find folks. Like everyone else, we had assumptions and guesses as to why. We started brainstorming solutions to kind of solve those guesses that we had, but we came down with the conclusion is like, why are we guessing and why don't we really ask our community, right? So we partnered with Calvin Social Research Institute to help design, a survey, a robust survey that was sent out to about 10,000 people that were active on the Pure Michigan Talent Connect, and that also received our Hot Jobs Blast. For context, this survey ran from January to February, and we know those were some really interesting times where a lot of social, political, and racial tensions were happening around that time. We had a total of 799 respondents, where we collected data like age, race, gender, and obviously county. Some of the key findings from the survey. One thing that this is a conversation that we've had over the years, but it was really interesting to kind of see in this survey is older workers are engaged, and they're ready to find work, but yet they're still finding issues to finding employment, right? So we surveyed from 55 to 64-year-old made up 33.9% of our respondents, and a lot of their comments were about some of the barriers for them to find employment was the fact that they were in that age group. So possibly age discrimination, right? So, either be it real or perception, I think we need to find, solutions to help those job seekers, that specific demographic, overcome some of that. And then also we need to emphasize to employers, like, hey, you're in need of people. You're in need of qualified individuals that have experience, that have great work ethic, that will show up on time, so that they need to spend a little bit more time in kind of tapping into that particular demographic. Now, some of the main questions from the survey were, are you looking for work? Interesting enough, 75% of our respondents indicated that they were actively looking for work. So again, it came to a surprise to us because, the low numbers of our engagement in our centers, the feedback from our employers. So we're wondering, like, what is the mismatch? Like, what is it that we're missing? The next question was, how much effort are you able to dedicate towards finding work? As we all are in this space, and we are well aware that job searching and looking for a job is a full-time job within itself. And then some of the findings from that question was only 23% could dedicate a great deal to finding work, and over 40% could only dedicate a moderate amount. So there is this connection of the amount of time that people spend to look for work. There were some statistics about, hey, maybe we don't necessarily have the resources, or some of the places where I used to find work are no longer open. And I think that there is, again, a disconnect. Like, we at West Michigan Works, we never closed. Like, we still, we pivoted, right? We offered all the services that we normally do, just in a different framework. I know some of the other panel representatives have talked about, the digital divide and, has that become a bigger barrier? And again, we as West Michigan Works have tried to alleviate some of those issues. So another question that we asked was, how much success are you having looking for work? This was another mismatch that we feel that we need to dig a little bit deeper, as only 18% had a lot to a great deal of success, compared to 82% had little to no success, and over 40% stated that they had no success at all, right? So, if you have all these individuals looking for, 75% of individuals looking for work, but yet 82% are not finding any success, 40% not at all, but yet employers are saying, we are in constant need of individuals, and there's something there that we kind of really need to dig a little bit deeper. Some of the other questions that we asked were, what are barriers to job search and looking for work? Some of the from most concerning to least concerning is, we saw that individuals indicated that wages were not enough. So 66.6% either stated they were they either somewhat or strongly agreed to that, and over 40% stated that they strongly agreed to those things. So there's a couple things to look at this, right? So a couple things to consider. So the extra payments from UIA. So if an employer is not paying at least that or more than that, is it worth for a job seeker to go back to work, right? I'm glad that Dr. Powell talked about women in the workforce, right? Another thing that we have to consider is, I have 130,000. He stated 135,000 fewer women in Michigan, right? And what are the implications of it? I think as nationwide is over 1 million, right? And is this a gender recession, right? We know that women earn significantly less than men, right? And all of that is compounded on top of this global pandemic that we are currently going through, right? One neat thing that came out of this, and obviously, we're in the space of, transitioning people and providing opportunities for secondary education and for career laddering, was, job seekers indicated that my skills don't meet available jobs, right? So we're in constant conversations with employers, and they always will say that. It's like, hey, there's this skills gap, right? We don't have qualified individuals. It was interesting to see that job seekers also align to that struggle. So we at West Michigan Works are always looking at, how can we be more equitable? Making sure that we put, our equity lens. So one of the results that we populated by race was, to what extent are workplaces with available jobs not welcoming to someone like me? This was some interesting data, and we saw some significant disparities between race, right? And we have to do our due diligence, right, to educate employers to making sure that they are establishing equitable workplaces, right? And that everyone's not necessarily coming from the same place, that everyone has their own journey, right? And then, lastly, I'll talk a little bit about, families with school-age children, have had their own hardships, with either, full virtual schooling or hybrid schooling or childcare concerns. So we surveyed individuals particularly that indicated that it was difficult to find work because of childcare. It was difficult because either they couldn't pay for it, or their children were attending school virtually part-time, and 65.3% strongly agreed that paying for daycare was a significant barrier, right? 53% indicated that it was difficult for them to find childcare. So one, paying for daycare, but also having available childcare providers, right? Some of the other things that kind of came out were, transportation. We thought transportation was going to be a higher concern. It was, but not as high as we projected to see. And then we asked some questions about resources, right? You know, these are the barriers, these are the issues, but what about some resources that are out in the community? And we saw that, you know, job seekers want information about how employers have a clear, you know, kind of plan on protecting their employees, right? We saw inquiries about having appropriate technology and equipment. We saw, you know, some things about flexible schedules and part-time, and we relate that to some of those issues with you know, school-age children. Yeah, I got a couple more statistics, but due to time, I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Juan. We have about 11 minutes left, so we're going to focus these next 2 questions for the entire panel. Actually, most of our speakers today have spoken about the pandemic, how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted women and individuals of color. They have accounted for the vast majority of job losses during the crisis and are facing a slower recovery. What does this mean for any gains they had previously made in the job market, and how long could it take to make up those losses? Scott, I'd like to start with you first. This seems like it really, you touched upon a lot of this during your earlier conversation.
Yeah, I think as far as the predictive component goes, like I said, it's really tough to know what the long-term effect of this is going to be, right? So I would say it's really unknown how long it'll take, but I think that on the predict, I would point to some of our partners at the University of Michigan and RSQE. I think they do a great job with a lot of this work as far as looking into those more near-term predictions. So I would point people there if they're not familiar with that resource. But yeah, it's definitely going to have some kind of an impact, but what it'll be precisely, it's tough to say right now.
Thank you, Scott. Mike, I'd like to see if you could weigh in from the ALICE perspective on that question.
So as I mentioned before, you know, we have some real disparities, people of color, but I also within the report, it identifies single women with children are probably one of the highest percentage of ALICE that we have. I think it's up over 70%. And this is, again, I go prior to the pandemic and the realities of all of these being severely impacted by this. I think it's going to create some real obstacles and challenges. And I know we're going to get to a question that talks about the barriers or removing the barriers to be able to move this forward, but that's going to be critical as we try to transition these individuals into some opportunity of success moving forward.
Thank you, Mike. Next question. We have talked a lot this morning about the many different issues or barriers that exist regarding job seekers as a result of the pandemic. How can we move forward working together as partners to impact policy in Michigan to assist job seekers and effectively address our own poverty issues? I'd like to start with Lew first on that one. Lew, I'd like to get your thoughts, please.
Yeah, sure. You know, and this is obviously not a quick answer to a very complicated problem, but there's a number of things that we can do. You know, the daycare issue we know is one that I think, you know, benefits everybody. So looking forward to, you know, how we can strategize around that. And, you know, the task force report obviously has some recommendations on that. The other thing that I think is like a real kind of near-term action that I think we all could partner on is making sure that the new federal benefits that are going to be available here for the next period, you know, year or two, are access to help individuals really get stabilized. You know, I'll turn to like the child tax credits, right? You know, we know that there is those credits will help out a lot of families and will help them stabilize, and from there, then hopefully can grow and build up and upscale up the economic ladder. So, you know, one of the things that's real specific, I think, is how do we get folks attached to that who may not already be? University of Michigan is working, I know, on a website with the federal government. Once that comes out this summer, I think that's a real tangible thing that we can do to make sure that people eligible for those benefits get attached to it.
Thank you, Lew. Does any of our panel members like to elaborate on that question as well?
Yeah, I'll just say is the advocacy part, you know, especially with childcare, especially some of these huge barriers that individuals are facing. I think as a system, we really have to compile our data, compile our efforts, and be that voice for you know, for our job seekers, for our residents that are struggling with this. You know, like, you know, Michigan League for Public Policy gave a presentation to the Essential Needs Task Force. You know, and they had some interesting information about the new rescue plan that's coming. You know, they stated that 702.5 million is going to go to Michigan specifically to help childcare providers with operation support, right? 493.2 million, again, specifically for Michigan, will go to provide childcare, right? And expanding childcare eligibility, right? A lot of subsidies are currently now for individuals that fall under a particular income, but yet we know that childcare is affecting people from across the spectrum. So it's all, again, advocating for the struggle that people are going through, and collectively using our power and our influence to kind of make sure these resources are specifically going to our folks. So.
Thank you, Juan. And thank you to all of our panel members for a great discussion today. Do any of you have any final thoughts you would like to share?
I think connected to that last question, Chris, I would just say, you know, as final thoughts, you've heard a lot of common themes today. I think, you know, we know what some of these issues are that are connecting these things, right? So childcare is a big one. You just heard Juan talk about that. You heard me talk earlier about the role of education, right? And we know we have some programs set up through, you know, Frontliners and now Reconnect and Skills Scholarship Program in the state, right? So education training is really critical. And so we've got these programs in place now. We need to just keep on moving forward with them. I think that's definitely part of the solution. And I think another common thread you heard across everybody today was, you know, data. We're trying to collect data. We're trying to bring data together to figure out precisely, you know, try to target our efforts at precisely what the problem is, and we need to continue using data and for evidence-based decision making.
Thank you very much, Scott. Any other comments from the group? Okay, outstanding. Again, thank you to our panel members for their time and sharing their personal stories, knowledge, and thoughts with us today. The next panel discussion as part of the Workforce Advocacy Month will take place on Friday, April 16th at 11 a.m. This panel will focus on the impact of the pandemic on childcare. More information about this panel can be found at the association's website at michiganworks.org. And I was told by Steph Willis that the questions that were posted in the chat, we will definitely, they'll follow up with those people and try to get some at least discussion or answers for you. So again, thank you to everybody for participating today, and I hope everyone has a great day and a great weekend.